If you're watching the world of open source right now, you are seeing two things occurring simultaneously that should not be happening together. Two extreme things that absolutely boggle the mind how they could coexist simultaneously. The first is unprecedented levels of success. Absolutely amazing, staggering, and heartwarming, in some cases, levels of success in the open source ecosystem in terms of pure numbers of install bases. I mean, just look at Linux. Linux installed on over 56 million desktop or laptop PCs as of the last year. That's huge numbers. And sure, that may not be 50+% of the market share. That may not even be 5% of the market share of desktop and laptop PCs. But it's a big number, and it's bigger than it ever was before. Those are huge, huge numbers in terms of growth. And what's more, that's only a tiny fraction of what you see on servers, on mobile devices, on cloud devices and containers. It's crazy. The sheer install base is nuts. And then you break into the monetary side of things, and holy smokes, look at things like the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation is bringing in, what is this exactly here? I'm looking at one of the more recent Lunduke Journal articles covering it. Total revenues in 2022 of $250 million. Now, this is a foundation, mind you. This is the Linux Foundation. This isn't some giant for-profit corporation. This is a foundation. It's $250 billion. That's a massive amount of money, and it's not alone. I mean, if you go across the entirety of open source and open content, include things like Wikimedia. Wikimedia brings in, what is it here? It's 165 million in a year. I mean, huge numbers, huge numbers. Firefox, the makers of Firefox, Mozilla, bring in, what is it here, 600 million? Let's see if I get this right here. They include, let's see, 400 million in cash. Revenue in 2021 was just over $600 million, over $500 million for the makers of an open source web browser. It's crazy. It's crazy. And yet, while that same financial success and install base success is happening, and it's massive, we are at the same time seeing what appears to be a direct, purposeful effort to destroy, to self-destruct open source software from within. So I would like to pose a few questions here. And we're going to go through some examples here so we can try to answer these. But here's a few questions. First, is the world of open source software destroying itself, right? Is it self-destructing? Let's answer that question first before we move on to everything else, because if it's not, well, then this whole conversation is meaningless. But if the answer is yes, and I'm just gonna do a little spoiler here, yeah, it is. But if the answer is yes, then we have to ask the question, why? Why is open source software self-destructing? For what purpose? Is it purposeful? Is it accidental? Is it some sort of an offshoot of other problems? If it is purposeful, what is the purpose? What could the purpose possibly be to destroy something that is truly achieving unimaginable levels of success from 10 years ago? I mean, it's off the charts. Why destroy it? And how exactly is that happening? Now, and once we answer all of that, I think a really reasonable question to ask here is, what, if anything, can be done to stop it? What, if anything, can be done to stop this self-destruction that we're seeing here? So I'm gonna walk through a couple of examples here. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm just going to go through a smattering of some of the Lunduke Journal articles that cover some of this, so that we can get a taste for how this self-destruction is occurring, and maybe think of ways we can actually stop this. The first because this goes all over the map here. This really goes all over the map. The first thing I would like to point out is the open source initiative, because we're talking about the destruction of open source software. So why not start with the open source initiative itself? Now, the open source initiative is interesting because it doesn't really make anything. It doesn't make any software. What it really does is it blesses licenses. It says, yes, I bless you, my son. You are a good open source software license. They are the keeper of what is known as the open source definition, the definition of what open source software is. Now, what's fascinating about that is this definition of an open source software license has more or less existed roughly the same as how the creator, Bruce Perens, created it many, many years ago. What's fascinating is none of the founders of the open source initiative are currently allowed to have involvement in the open source initiative. Both Bruce Perens and Eric Raymond were banned from even joining like mailing lists. It's ridiculous. They're not allowed to talk. They're not allowed to open their mouths in anything related to the open source initiative. It's wild. So this organization really isn't what it once was. But one thing that's happening there that I find truly peculiar is in an attempt to maybe cash in on artificial intelligence. Maybe that's what's going on. Maybe in an attempt to stay relevant in an ever-changing technological landscape, the open source initiative has decided to create the open source artificial intelligence definition. Essentially, what sort of licenses, what set of licenses would an artificial intelligence and a large language model type system have to conform to in order to be considered open source? And what's truly fascinating about it is that it is not at all open. It truly isn't. Like for an AI model, in order to be open, in order to functionally be able to replicate how an AI system would behave, you have to replicate the entirety of the data used to train it. That's part of the system. But the open source initiative, funded in large part by some very large corporations who have a vested interest in closed source AI systems, have decided to say that you can have an open source AI model that is not at all open. It's a fascinating thing. So from this example, what can we learn from that? Well, we could say big companies coming in with a stated agenda are saying flat out, hey, we want to adjust what defines open source. So they're pushing their agenda. Big billion-dollar corporations are pushing an agenda. Okay, does that apply across the board though? Let's look at another example here. Let's look at NixOS for a moment. NixOS is interesting because there's really two major aspects to this project. The first is that it's a Linux distribution, a very popular one. And the second is that it's kind of a packaging system and package format, right? And it's gained incredible popularity for very good reasons. It has some very, very interesting technical aspects to it. And it has almost completely imploded on itself. The significant organizers and board members and moderation team members have organized together and committed what they declared to be a purge, their word, of, quote, Nazi contributors. Right? Now, were those people that they were purging actual Nazis? No, they weren't. Instead, what it really turned out to be was there were some people that were centrist or right-leaning, and the people who were hard extremist left-leaning declared all of them Nazis and kicked them out of the project or banned them from the project, and actually forced out the founder of the project itself. The founder of NixOS is not part of NixOS anymore. He was kicked. He abdicated by force. You know what I'm saying? Like it wasn't like technically he was banned. He was not banned. Wink, wink. Right? He was abdicating. Right? And this sort of thing seems to happen a bit. So now here's an example where, yes, the organization NixOS has a foundation behind it, and they do receive money from corporations, but that doesn't seem to be behind their self-destruction. This self-destruction seems to be more coming from an ideological and political wave. And we see a lot of that happening just all over the place. And that doesn't really stop there, though. A case in point, Mozilla. Now, Mozilla makes a ton of money because of Firefox. I mean, $500 million per year or more because of Firefox. Sure, they have a lot of other projects they're working on. In fact, they're putting all of their eggs in the future into the AI basket, which is weird. But they seem to be imploding from very different directions. First and foremost, there was recently a sort of, I kind of dubbed it a Game of Thrones style power struggle, but what really happened was individuals on the board of directors of Mozilla came in and took advantage of a moment when the person who was about to assume the CEO role was out sick. And they took that moment to oust that person, to install a new CEO voted on by the board, making sure that person, that new CEO, was a board member, and then they began to change the organization and company radically, right? So then they started working on turning Mozilla entirely into an advertising and AI-driven company. Now, that may be good, that may be bad, but what you see with that is a distinct move away from open source software and internal power struggles where long-term people advocating for open source software are ousted, are tossed out on their keister. Now, in this case, you can find little hints of politicalness here. You can find hints of corporate overlordiness here, but you also just see an intense level of power struggles, of people who are seeking to obtain power and are willing to just destroy in order to make it happen. It's a fascinating thing that's going on there. And it's sort of at the backdrop of all of this, we're seeing Mozilla have a really uncertain financial future because almost all of their current revenue comes via a search placement deal with Google, making Google the default search partner for Firefox. So it's just tumultuous. So is there an influence from big corporate entities here? Absolutely. Is there a little bit of political stuff at play? Yeah, there really does seem to be. This one kind of goes all over the map. And it goes on from there. Python recently has had a number of very, very strange events occurring with it. Now, Python's interesting because it's just a programming language, right? It's not an operating system. It's not a high-profile web browser. It's simply a very commonly used programming language. I mean, Python in all of the Stack Overflow lists of top however many programming languages, it's always very high up there. I mean, it's a very commonly used language on Linux desktops and on a lot of server systems. It's all over the place. And they have a foundation, the Python Software Foundation. And they are starting to get a little strange. They are beginning to ban people for political reasons from being involved in Python and in the Python Software Foundation. And so what we're seeing here does not appear to be, at first glance, anything corporate. It doesn't appear to be anything monetary at all, right? It doesn't even necessarily appear to be like an outside power struggle. It appears to be very specifically politically motivated, as though certain individuals who have a certain level of power within the Python Software Foundation are not okay with other people having the wrong politics. And so we see people being banned entirely long term, since almost the first days of Python contributors being ousted, being suspended for just seemingly made up reasons. It's a fascinating thing that's occurring there, and it does seem to be entirely politically motivated. Now, this goes on and on. I want to touch on one or two other examples here, because I think they they shed some light into the overall idea of what is really happening here. And the first is Gnome. The first is the Gnome Foundation. And if you've followed, excuse me, if you've followed what the Lunduke Journal has been reporting over the last, say, 6 months or so, you've seen a number of articles on some strange things that have been happening within Gnome. But what's truly fascinating with all of this is there's not a lot of money here. Gnome itself brings in startlingly little money considering how popular it is. Now we talked. Where's those numbers again? We talked about the 56 million desktop Linux PCs running out there, and that doesn't even include the server systems. And the server systems, by and large, are running Gnome. Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE Linux, Ubuntu, all of it is by default Gnome. Now, people can install whatever they want. It's Linux. That's just the way of things. But the reality is most of it is Gnome. Gnome is the desktop environment that is most commonly used on Linux machines. It just is. It's not the one I use, but it is the most popular by far, including in the corporate world. But it has startlingly little finances. Those companies, Red Hat and SUSE and Ubuntu, Canonical, all of them that derive so much value from Gnome, really don't invest back into it. So there's not a great deal of corporate or monetary power struggling going on here. The issues with Gnome, which we'll talk about a couple of them, appear to be entirely individual, like person-to-person power struggling and political power struggling. For example, Gnome banned a core team member of Manjaro, which the person who actually packages Gnome for the Manjaro Linux distribution, because he said my name. Right, like literally, he said my name. He linked to some article or another, and that got him banned, permanently banned from being involved in Gnome. It's a fascinating thing, and huge problems. They even went on and made an official policy where if you say the name Lunduke or link to Lunduke, you get banned. Which I just want to, as an aside, thank you once again to Gnome for doing that, because those sorts of things is probably the best advertisement that could possibly exist for the Lunduke Journal. Please make more rules against saying the word Lunduke. Like you'll hunt people down and murder them or something if they say the word Lunduke. Please just go extreme with it, because man, oh man, when you guys made that rule, the subscription numbers to the Lunduke Journal just skyrocketed, but beyond my wildest dreams. So please keep that up. But Gnome keeps doing really weird things. Do I have this here? Yeah, like they came up with this 5-year plan recently. And the 5-year plan was supposed to be, what they stated it was a 5-year roadmap to profitability, because they were having a problem. They were spending more money than they were taking in, and they just weren't taking in that much. They had to come up with a way to make more money. So how are they going to do that? Well, they came up with a 5-year plan, and their 5-year plan had no details whatsoever on how they were going to make money. They had no details on how much money they were going to be able to get by maybe working with Red Hat and Canonical and SUSE and all these other big companies that were shipping Gnome and making billions on it in some cases. But no, they didn't include any of that. What they included was a couple-page bullet list of diversity, equity, inclusion, and an idea that eventually they might make a PowerPoint presentation to talk about how Gnome is pretty good. Like, it was the strangest thing. It was, and this was supposedly something that had been worked on for half a year, and had been studied, and they'd really worked hard on it, and they brought in this new executive director to build this amazing 5-year plan. But it was a 5-year plan of dooming Gnome to failure, like, is really what it was. And that was a choice that they made. Now, that, when you look at it, with such an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, which almost always leads to financial ruin. It's just an understanding at this point. Whether you like diversity, equity, inclusion, and all that sort of thing, it almost doesn't matter. When you focus your business around that, it really, more often than not, leads to financial ruin. And all of the people running Gnome, they have to know that, right? Because they spent half a year working on this. So clearly they would have looked at other industries and other organizations and foundations who have done a similar thing and come to the conclusion that, yes, that's not a path to profitability for us. Let's either make a different goal or change our strategy. But they didn't. They chose actively to have a strategy of failure. It's fascinating. And then they began to have internal turmoil, and they started kicking out board members and keeping it super secret. And they did it in secret meetings that they wouldn't document. They refused to document the votes on kicking out board members, elected board members. And they didn't even tell the people who voted for that board member that they'd kicked out that board member that had been voted on for 2 months. And only then did they tell them when it was about to be revealed publicly. It's just this fascinating amount of personal power struggle and political power struggle that seems to be just utterly destroying this project. A project that, again, is a cornerstone of Red Hat Enterprise, of SUSE Linux Enterprise, of Ubuntu. If Gnome as a software project fails, if it begins to falter, all of these, billions of dollars in yearly revenue could be somewhat at stake. Certainly they'd have to be changing. And that's a fascinating thing to me, that all of these corporations would allow that to be happening, when any one of them at any time could swoop in, save the day, and completely take over the project. But they choose not to. Why? Why do they see it self-destructing? Why do they see the organizers of this project eating themselves alive? And they say, you know what? That's great. I love that. I love the destruction thing. Let's see more of that. Why? How utterly peculiar. When with Pocket Change, Red Hat and IBM could swoop in and with Pocket Change completely take over one of the projects that is the cornerstone of billions in revenue. But they don't. To transition to for a moment here, when we see new open source projects come out and become popular, become exciting, get press, there's a certain segment of the open source world that hates that, right? That sees that and attacks. Now, I'm not saying criticizes, but attacks. A case in point, the Ladybird web browser. The Ladybird web browser is an interesting project in that it has a significant amount of funding, a lot of momentum towards building a brand new, from scratch, web browser engine and web browser. It's a very worthwhile project considering everything that's happening at Google and Mozilla and etc. But when it began to get significant funding, when it became clear that that project had a roadmap to success, not a clear victory, not a workable beta even, but just a roadmap to a potential success. When that occurred, a certain segment of the open source population pounced. They attacked. They came up with crazy theories about how the developers were promoting human slavery, which is the weirdest thing I could possibly think of. It's very strange. We don't like you, therefore you are a human slave trader. Like, what? He's making a web browser. I don't think he's a slave owner. They accuse them of transphobia and all sorts of other things. And of course, This 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 group, this segment of the open source world is distinctly very political. They are on the hard political left. They are again those leftist extremists. But they see something good happening. They see a new successful thing happening in open source. They attack it. And this is a common recurring thing. NixOS was seeing increased success. So what happened? Hardcore leftist extremists attacked it so that it couldn't be as successful. This kind of goes on and on. Elementary OS. Elementary OS is an interesting project in that you'll note that I have talked about it for years. In fact, I do these yearly Linux sucks shows where I make fun of / love on Linux for a little bit. And going back 10 or more years, I've talked about how Elementary was setting itself up to an interesting level of success because they were doing something that was both tried and true and with a new sheen on it, that they were having potential success, right? They were having actual employees. They got to the point where I think they had 4 employees at its height. And yes, that's not a big mega corporation, but when we're talking about a small open source project moving forward and growing into something successful, that's rather exciting. That's uplifting to see that sort of thing happening. That's a positive thing. As it started to gain in success, its own creators decided to destroy it. And Elementary OS even went so far as to make declarations as soon as they started to see that level of success of being able to have multiple employees and having financial stability. They started attacking people who used and contributed to Elementary OS. They said flat out that they didn't want people who were right-wing to use Elementary OS, to contribute to Elementary OS. And when they said right-wing, what they really meant was anyone anywhere who wasn't extreme leftist, right? Centrists, leaning right, even left-leaning centrists were too right-wing for Elementary OS. And so they started attacking viciously and saying some really horrible things. And what has happened? Well, they went from 4, I think it was, employees to absolutely like barely 1, and they're just kind of falling apart, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere, and it's faltering and dying. See, it's this consistent thing where they see success in an open source project, and as soon as they see success, they begin to hate. And they start taking it down. Asahi Linux is doing a similar thing. openSUSE is doing a similar thing where the openSUSE project was seeing growth. Full disclosure, I used to be on the openSUSE board, an elected board member. I used to work at SUSE as a person in marketing. And so I was responsible for some of that growth. And as the growth was ramping up in terms of just user base, it was becoming increasingly significant. They began to attack not just the people involved in the project, but the users themselves, their board members, their SUSE employees, even their previous board of director, chairman of the board, came out and said that anyone who had the wrong political ideas was rotten flesh. They used the word rotten flesh repeatedly, that rotten flesh needed to be cut out. And they said if you didn't wave the transgender and LGBT flag actively, that you were that rotten flesh. And they did a lot of things like that. And regardless of what you or I or anyone else thinks of those political ideas of saying you must actively wave and support the banner of this particular cause, to say if you don't actively support this non-related to this piece of software cause, you're out. You shouldn't. They even said flat out, we hope you're not welcome anywhere in the Linux world. You are so rotten flesh. That makes it so they begin to destroy that success that they were having, right? And again, we're seeing it from a political standpoint, right? There's not a corporate or financial incentive here. This is harming the SUSE bottom line here. And that's fascinating. And we're seeing a similar thing happen over on the Red Hat side of things. Many of you have seen like the Red Hat and IBM leaks where they are pursuing some distinctly illegal discrimination in their employment practices. And clearly those are going to end up harming IBM and Red Hat and their bottom line, because there's lots of lawsuits that are just spinning up, including like state governments are suing them and individual employees are suing them. It's going to be nonstop. But they're also, Red Hat employees are actively attacking other open source community members, right? We're seeing this regularly. So there's the Hyperland example hyperland up. For those of you who aren't familiar, essentially a Red Hat employee decided that this person did not like Hyperland. And Hyperland is a window manager, is a Linux window manager that sits on top of Wayland. Okay, all right. Is it actively used by a bazillion people? Nope. It's gaining in some popularity and it's quite cool. I like it. Is Red Hat shipping it? No, it's not part of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's not like their default setup. They ship with Gnome. They don't ship with Hyperland. Okay, so why do they have interest in this? And I don't know. But what they decided to do was attack that person and get the lead developer of that project banned from a project called Free Desktop. And Free Desktop is kind of this umbrella foundation that controls things like Wayland and whatnot. And why would they do that, right? It's not for financial reasons, right? Because there's no financial incentive to either support or attack Hyperland because they don't ship Hyperland. But there is political incentive here in order to try and ban or ostracize anyone who doesn't, in theory, actively support certain politics. And in this particular case, they were accused of essentially wrongthink the developer of Hyperland and tossed out of the Free Desktop project by Red Hat employees. And Red Hat sanctioned it, supported it, never spoke out against it. They were cool with it. But why? A lot of these things continue to be happening where employees, prominent employees within significant open source companies attack other people. They just go after them. They attack. One example that I find truly peculiar, System 76, a company that many of you who have been around the Linux Journal world or the Lunduke Journal, sorry, slip. I used to write for Linux Journal magazine. Now I run Lunduke Journal. But many of you who have followed my work with the Lunduke Journal for years will recognize System 76 as a sponsor of the Lunduke Journal back when the Lunduke Journal still accepted sponsors. I don't do sponsors anymore. I don't allow any company to pay me money because they can influence me, and they always tried, and I didn't like it. But System 76 is a company that ships desktops and servers and laptops preloaded with Linux. And until recently, that was always Ubuntu, but they shifted over to having their own Ubuntu-based Linux distribution that they call Pop! OS. And Pop! OS is not bad. It's not. I mean, it has some distinctly good qualities to it. In fact, I have a lot of good things I could say about Pop! OS. But they have one individual who is their principal engineer at System 76, who is the man who's really responsible for Pop! OS. He's kind of like the Pop! OS lead. He's the lead maintainer. He's the guy that really runs the show when it comes to Pop! OS. He came out and started attacking Linux developers, just in general, like all Linux kernel developers, calling them patronizing, pedantic megalomaniacs. And he said, quite frankly, directly, that he doesn't try to contribute to the Linux kernel anymore because of that. Now, maybe there's political stuff at play there. Maybe there's not. Maybe it's just a working thing. Maybe it's not. Maybe he's 100% right. Maybe he's not. But what's fascinating here is you see individuals, high-profile individuals within open source companies going on an attack, saying, I'm going to attack other open source projects, open source companies, in this case, the very project upon which they build their entire business, and say that the people who run that project are patronizing, pedantic megalomaniacs. Now, you'd think attacking and saying, I will not work with the people that run the project that your very business relies upon is a bad business strategy, right? But they go with it. And in fact, System 76 has fully supported this individual saying this and is not taking it back, is not telling him to take it back. It's like, no, that's fine. Fascinating. Now, is there anything political about this? But you know what? It doesn't look like it. I'm sure we could come up with some ways if we twist it to say, oh, there's some political thing here. But realistically, what we can say definitively is it's an attack on the people that are responsible for the software that makes their business possible. And they're going with it. It is a self-destructive action. Now, is there a financial benefit to that action? No, not really. Is there a political motivation to that action? No, not really. It's just self-destructive. It's just self-destructive. There's so much happening here that is just purely self-destructive. One final example, and then I want to talk about this for a second here. The Internet Archive. I know this isn't specifically open source software. The Internet Archive has just recently lost one of their appeals. They're getting sued into oblivion right now, right? Just utterly sued into oblivion. They're being sued by Sony and Universal Music Group and Random House and Penguin Publishers. Like they're being sued, and there's just no way they're going to survive long term. But what's fascinating here is they're pushing kind of an open data, open information, Creative Commons stuff is readily commonly pushed on the Internet Archive. And so that's why I want to mention it, because I think there's something about it that's the same as what we're saying in the open source world. The Internet Archive is getting sued because of specific choices that they keep making. And they keep making those choices over and over again. They choose to host content which is in violation of the copyrights of the copyright holders. They choose to do that, and they fight to do that. They want to do that. They know they're going to get sued, right? They know it. They almost encourage themselves to get sued. And so they're self-destructing. They're going to go out of business because they choose to do all this. And if you want more details on this, because I know we're going real high level, going over to the Lunduke Journal, lunduke.locals.com to read through all the details. There's really a lot here to discuss. But they're making that choice. So what I want to say here is this. I think we can definitively say that the world of open source software and open media and open data and open information in general is destroying itself, or at least attempting to, right? It looks pretty obvious. At least a significant portion of the open source world is trying to just destroy itself. So then the question that must inevitably follow is why, for what purpose, to what end? And the reality is, I can't really pinpoint that. There are many examples where political ideologies come into play. And we went through a number of them here, and there's many, many more. And I would say that more than any other one specific motivating factor, political ideology, being extreme leftist political ideology, appears to be a part of those self-destructive actions, right? Whether it's NixOS or Elementary OS or what's happening with SUSE and openSUSE and Red Hat and so many other projects. The extreme leftist political ideologies do tend to be a part of that, but that is not all of it. That just is not all of it. There are examples where it's just money coming in from corporations, or just a strange hatred of success. We see examples where, organizations that are achieving certain levels of success get attacked, oftentimes from within. But the attack seems to be spurred on because they were successful. I'm going to put out there a simple idea. A significant portion of the open source world loathes success. They see success as an evil. Success in market share of user install base, of money, of total employee count, those become an evil. Whether it's because it's capitalism or just successfulness. I think there's a large number of people that intrinsically begin to hate these open source projects, these software projects, when they become successful. And there seems to be a Venn diagram that's almost a perfect circle, where those individuals tend to also be extreme leftists politically. So therefore, that's the tool that they use to attack. And they may also just be attacking things because of political reasons. And yet there are also obvious examples where corporations or foundations are eating themselves from the inside out because of the influence of some corporations. So obviously this is happening. And for those of you who have watched the world of open source software for many years, this is new. Open source has always had drama. Always. And sometimes it's crazy drama. Sometimes it's off the charts wild drama. But what it's never had is a concerted, constant set of examples that flow out almost weekly of organizations utterly destroying themselves from the inside out. The Lunduke Journal covers these when they happen to significant open source and Linux and whatnot organizations, because it needs to be covered. But honestly, I would like to be able to cover it a whole lot less. But it happens so regularly that sometimes it's like, okay, I'm covering them this week. Okay, well now next week it's NixOS. The week after that it's Python. The week after that it's openSUSE. Oh, there's another lawsuit against Reddit. Like it's just a constant ongoing thing. This is new. I've been covering Linux for 15 years? No, 18 years? No, yeah, 18 years. I've been covering Linux professionally for about 18 years now, and I can say definitively this is new. If any one of the stories that we just talked about had happened in a year, let's say 15 years ago, that would be a story of the year. At the end of the year, when all the journalists write their wrap up of the 5 biggest Linux stories of the last year, that any one of these would make it. But yet, almost all of these happened in the last 6 to 9 months. And when we get to the point of the end of this year and we write those wrap ups of the 5 biggest stories of the year, most of these won't even make it. It's crazy. It's absolutely absurd. So it's definitely happening. We are witnessing the self-destruction of open source software. And I'm going to say that it appears to be purposeful. People don't repeatedly do the same thing over and over again without purpose. Because many of the individuals involved in some of these things that we've talked about are in multiple stories. For example, some of the individuals in the Gnome stories and the NixOS stories are the same people. Oftentimes enacting the same sorts of policies where it rips the project apart from the inside out. And yeah, sometimes there's political ideology at play and sometimes there's not, but a lot of times there are. And it does seem to be purposeful. So the question comes, what can be done to stop it? And I think realistically, and this I think needs to be a follow-up discussion that we have here. We have to declare it as a bad thing. We have to point at it, publish it, document the heck out of it, so that when we're looking back over the last year, we can say, this is what happened. This is what you said. This is what these people did to this project. This is why they said they did it to this project. And these are the results, right? So that when we look back over the last, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, however long, we can point to it and say, this is exactly what happened. Sunshine is always the best disinfectant, right? So we need to document it. Now, so far, the Lunduke Journal is pretty alone in documenting 9 out of 10 of these sorts of stories. A few of them get documented here and there in piddling ways, but the Lunduke Journal is pretty much alone in documenting most of this. So I need to keep doing it. It would be great if we could get more open source and just tech journalists actually covering these sorts of topics. That would help substantially. But in the meantime, that aside, because that's not going to happen, the Lunduke Journal needs to continue to cover it. And people need to speak out, right? So, like, for example, the Gnome Foundation has banned me, right? Not me joining them, but me existing. They if you utter my name, link to me, allude to my existence, you're kicked out of the Gnome software project entirely. It's happened to tons of people now. I get emails about it regularly. The Gnome Foundation, if they see you posting in their forum a link to a Lunduke article or something like that, they'll delete it. They delete what you post. They ban you, and then I get an email from the person who gets banned, and they're like, what the heck? I thought that was a joke. Like, no, it's very real. But what needs to happen is people need to speak up. Like, this is a problem. You are destroying the project. And we have two paths we can go down with each of these projects where these sorts of things are happening. One is we completely oust the individuals who are taking part in, or who are destroying the projects, right? The people in NixOS, the people in Python, the people in Gnome, etc. And if that's not possible, we need to abandon ship, fork, and go somewhere else, right? And the result is somewhat horrific there, because then it is a massive fracturing of the open source world. And that's not a great thing in a lot of ways, and it's good in some others. But the reality is there is at present no positive future in the open source world so long as the people who are seeking to destroy it remain in power. Now, why do they continue to destroy it? I don't know. You'd have to ask them, and you'd have to sit down with probably a psychotherapist for a very long period of time to figure out exactly why they're doing it. It's nonsense to me. But just the same, it's undeniable that they are doing it. And we've documented who they are. And we've documented what approaches they're taking. So we need to find a way to stop it if we are going to say that the future of successful projects releasing and publishing as open source is an important one. That we are going to say that successful foundations focused on free software is an important one. If it's not important, we can just say, okay, let it die. But I'm going to posit that it is important. I'm going to put out there that there is distinct value, and we can point to that distinct value again. Let me go over here. Because of the success that we're seeing. People want it. The success of open source is not because of these individuals that are running it, it's despite them. The success of Linux, the success of Gnome is despite the people running the Gnome Foundation, right? I would suggest that with proper management, those foundations would be significantly more successful. That's my positing there. And again, this could be a much larger discussion of exactly the sort of approaches we could take to actually stop this self-destruction that's occurring across dozens, if not hundreds, of significant and prominent open source projects, foundations, and companies right now. And the Lunduke Journal continues to publish new articles and shows about them almost every week. It's nonstop. But that almost is too long for today. If you have thoughts about it, I think the first and foremost thing to be done is to speak up. Not enough people are speaking up about it. If it's important to you, you got to do it. You got to do it. I'm doing my part. I feel like I'm an ad on Starship Troopers. I'm doing my part. And with that, I want to say thank you to all of the Lunduke Journal supporters and subscribers over at lunduke.locals.com and lunduke.com. Could not do this without you, because I sure as heck am not taking a dime from any of the companies and foundation I've just mentioned here today. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare end broadcast.